Aloha to everyone joining me today. I'm so happy to be here. I'm talking about a really tough subject. Some people think that standards are about rules, but in my world, it's really about life and death. I have a number of stories. I shared some photos of different events that happened during my time in the military. I'd like to talk about those and a number of other ways that standards impact our lives. In my world, engineering, military, leadership, and now it's been nonprofits and businesses and other things, standards are never just paperwork. They may appear like they're paperwork, but the fact is it's not. There's a difference between a building collapsing and people being able to walk out. That's the reason why when you look at the Khobar Towers, that building, despite the shape of the explosive and how it was directed, estimated between 30,000 pounds of TNT. That's a lot of TNT. And the building did not progressively collapse. The number one way most people died, like in Beirut, when the building collapsed. And in Khobar Towers, I was with the architect of that building. And I was talking about how terrible the building responded, and he said, no, you take a look at that and what the explosives were. That building remained standing because of some amazing military people. One of the airmen was raising the alarm because they had seen the people perpetrate the barrier, worried about that. And they were already getting people into a stairwell, which was to the backside of that building. And it was horrible that 19 people died, but it could have been so much worse. 400 were injured because of that blast, because it was just so huge. One person I know was running and completely blew his clothes off. But that was the impact. This huge blast impacted a lot of other buildings and, of course, what the body can withstand. You might have seen the picture of the Pentagon. The Pentagon was a place where I was serving on the anti-terrorism team, creating the minimum standards to keep people safe in DoD buildings, Department of Defense buildings. Now, either I have really good timing or not. The fact is, my predecessor worked very closely, Vince Kim, with the team that was renovating it. While you may think the Pentagon was this very strong building, it was not. It was like bricks, not reinforced on the outside. It would have collapsed in many ways, except that it was built during that post-war era. It was designed over a weekend and built in 18 months, very quickly. Concrete floors. When the building was hit, I was in the adjacent wedge, 5 wedges in a Pentagon, so we felt it. Oh my gosh, we felt it. But that plane went in on the ground level and was full of fuel. It hit fuel on the outside of the building from equipment that was there. And then, of course, it hit the very flammable materials that were inside the building. Yet the floors held for, I think it was about 15 minutes. If you weren't in the direct path, that building was robust enough that they could escape. And then you can see pictures where the floor fell. But initially it did not. Flash forward to another incident. So I will give some other examples, but engineer examples. This is where standards, the rubber meets the road. You really find out how well did we do. Captain Sully had a bird completely incapacitated his engines. He knew that he was in trouble and he needed to get down safely. People were giving him all kinds of information about what he was supposed to do. He had to take all that information and what he knew about the aircraft and the training that he'd had and the experience that he had. He put all that together and made the decision, we call it a command decision, to land that plane in the Hudson. Normally, water landings, especially with an aircraft like that, are very risky. But he knew that was the best chance. It gets me choked up every time I think about it. All 155 passengers survived. 5 were crew. That was just phenomenal. And then, of course, you had the whole city. It gets me really excited because it's not just the standards, it's when people see what's happening and they just do what they have to do in order to protect others. I'd ask you to take that energy that I'm conveying to you now, which brings me to tears, because anyone involved with that, they're my heroes. They stood up when others may not. They were paying attention when others may not. And they understood the standards of their protocols of using their equipment, but this was an unusual situation. And they rallied and got there to help all of them survive. 19 were killed at the Khobar Towers. When the Pentagon, we had everyone, 64 were on the plane, 125 were in the building of the Pentagon. They all died. Could have been much worse if that building had not had at least that initial wedge reinforced, because what happened, I was on the adjacent wedge just on the opposite side where it had been renovated with fire standards, which meant that the fire did not go through the ceiling or anything toward our way after the impact of that horrible day. But it did burn the other direction for days after that. I think even weeks after that. They were still putting it out because it hadn't been done. But if it hadn't hit that wedge, we might have lost the entire building and thousands of people in that incident. When I think about standards, I think about how people handle standards and the reactions that I would get when I would come and challenge standards. I would talk about standards or try to improve standards. That's the way to help save people and help us make better decisions and choices in our lives and help the team work together. I'm going to talk about 4 groups of people. I added the 4th one because I'm sorry, this is what we've come up against. I didn't really think about number 1, and I want you to set it aside because I'm not going to be talking about it anymore. Realize there are some people who I call the self-glorifiers. Those are the ones, they don't care about the rules. They're going to make up their own, and they're going to force everyone else or subjugate others to do it, even though it makes absolutely no sense and potentially people are harmed. There are people like that, and those are oftentimes in the criminal category, and they have to be dealt with in a particular way. You do the best you can. There really are 3 primary types of people that you'll meet that are around standards. You have one that are the enforcers. Those are the ones that the rules are there, rules are rules, you can't break them, and they have 0 humanity in my estimation. I understand why the rules are there, but they never make exceptions, the enforcers. They don't make exceptions, even if the rule doesn't make sense. Even if it was invented, don't cross that line. I've heard that before. They'd rather check the box and solve the problem. Enforcers, I've met them, and I still can get something. The one thing that I can get out of them, so, well, who made the rules? Was there anyone who can adjust that? I'll tell you one story on an enforcer who was trying to say, my soldier who had been awake for 72 hours after Grenada hit was put on a board, an administrative board that he was supposed to show up for. Well, at 72 hours, he was a basket case. He wasn't functioning very well at all. But the people surrounding that tasking were telling me, no, he has to go. And I'd say, well, who do I need to talk to for this? They said it was only the CG, which in our case was 18th Airborne Corps. Well, they didn't know. I actually knew the commanding general because he was a classmate of my father's. I went and I called his office. I didn't talk to him, but I called his office and I laid out the situation. And that situation, after telling them what I had been told, it turns out very shortly after, my soldier got pulled off that duty. It made sense. He could not have done a very good job if he had been on that duty. I still work with enforcers. The ones I love so much, they're the facilitators. The facilitators are the ones who are always trying, they understand the rule, but they also understand the context of the situation. Don't you love facilitators? Because they'll work with you to make sure that they protect people while getting whatever their mission is done. And I love the facilitators. They are the ones that help. Now, I'm not in any of those categories. I'm in the last category that I'll talk about, which I kind of gave you a hint of. I'm a disruptor. I'm in the 4th category. I'm not here to break the rules. But I will challenge the rules when I feel that they don't make sense, it's inappropriate, unhelpful, or harming people is the biggest one where I would step in, like my soldier. It's really solution and opportunity oriented. It's trying to find that answer. Some people would call me a pest. I'm okay. I'll take it. Because if it gets the change that's needed, then we will make that happen. There are other stories that I'd like to share, just a couple. When you think about standards, are you talking about a piece of equipment or are you talking about a pen? Now, if I buy a pen, I want it to last forever, right? But the designers, they got limits and they have to make it cost effective to build. If it's a building, in the past, they would look at making sure this is a lasting treasure. Today, they are not robust. And sometimes there are those who will just skimp. I talked about progressive collapse. Progressive collapse requires at least 5% added cost in order to make sure that the floors do not collapse if something should happen, whether it's a windstorm or a bomb or an explosion, maybe your gas blows up, or something like in Oklahoma where they had the terrible federal building that collapsed. It was progressive collapse that killed so many people and children. The DoD standards were designed that I worked on for buildings to protect people in terrorist attack. It was designed to be a minimum. And that was a way to at least show people, hey, if you haven't done this minimum standard, then you are risking everything for the people who are in your building. You are risking it all. And the pushback was huge. People saying, we're not going to do that. We can't do that. That's not helpful. But the engineers that I worked with analyzed and said, hey, these are the absolute minimum standards. You can always do more, but if you're not doing this, then all types of threat could harm you in a building. Potentially, if it's multi-story, cause progressive collapse, or in other cases, bad things happen that you can't control the air or things like that. Then I faced pressures. For example, in combat, I was pressured by one commander to close my projects. What did that mean? Well, he had on his books all these projects that had been started, but no one had closed it. What was my issue? There were no standards for what did that look like. We're in combat. We have people killing my contractors, killing my people, stopping projects in any number of ways hindering the projects. Yet he wanted me to close those projects. And I said, great, we'll close it. Please have your people give us what that looks like. What's the standard? What is the standard look like to close a building? Is it just that I sign off on it and that's it? Or am I supposed to hand over things? Or what does that look like? And wouldn't get it and yelled at me a lot. It humiliated some of my people in front of others because we didn't back down on that. Now, some pieces of equipment, you may design it, for example, the rovers. Some of those rovers that are on Mars, they were only designed for a very short period of time, and yet some of them have been operating for years. And we celebrated that. We continue to celebrate that. It was a robust design that it could keep working under those harsh conditions. There's another concept that I want to introduce. It's called fail safe and fail catastrophic. In our world, if a terrorist attacked a building, let's say they drove a vehicle to the front of the building. Now, for a long time, convenience was the criteria in constructing buildings. So they literally could get up to 80 or so miles an hour with a bomb-filled vehicle and crash and blow up the building. Then we started putting in berms, which is site placement, the cheapest way to create more security and safety. And we would put these dirt berms out there. Now, they would only last once, but they would fail safe, what we call fail safe. You couldn't use them again exactly as they were because they'd been used. And then you needed to rebuild it and reinforce it for another incident. But at least they worked once in the way intended to save lives. But if it failed catastrophic, that's like the building collapse. That's like everybody dies. 95 or more percent of the people died in the building if it progressively collapsed. So that's an important concept because that'll become clear when I remind you of some of the things to consider when you're talking about standards. Now, you could have a changing situation, as I mentioned earlier, where you have to take a look at the standard and say, Is that still appropriate? Does it still make sense? Then there's another thing called lagging indicators, which is you may have a situation where it looks like it's going to work, but you need to monitor to see does it do the job that you're really wanting it to do, because you may not find out until years later that it is catastrophic. The other one is some people create arbitrary standards where they just make this stuff up. It's like, you got to get it to me on this time. Well, what's driving that? Is there some latitude? Maybe I can provide more information that would help on this. I come to find out a lot of times it was arbitrary. Sometimes they're power plays. That's why people put in standards. I'm going to shut this off right now, and that is a power play. Doesn't make much sense for those who are living it and trying to make it work. Oh, an even worse one was a timeline. Those standards, we're going to hand this over at this date. Do you know what that was for terrorists? That was a boon. They would be so happy when we would say, we're leaving at this amount of time, because then they would plan for it and they would do the most destruction that they could. This happened while I was there in Fallujah. What happened to us is that if we wanted to go into Fallujah during combat, we had given up the city of Fallujah. Marines who had paid with their lives to secure it originally. Then we were just on the perimeter. What happened is the terrorists took it over because the Iraqi people were not prepared. It wasn't their fault. They weren't ready. A timeline is arbitrary. It's a terrible tragedy. If I had a meeting in the middle of Fallujah, imagine a circle where you have no control really in the circle except the road going into the center and leaving. We would be in firefights going into the center, and then we would be in our meeting with the poor people of Fallujah who were dealing with this, the engineers and the leaders who were brave people who would come in, and then there would be mortars dropping. I got to the point that I had to look to the Marines who were securing our position and just say, okay, well, if they're not worried, I'm going to continue to work, even though I could hear what was going on all around me. And that is what happens. Very bad. Many people died because of this arbitrary timeline of we're going to make this happen on this date. I really urge you, timelines are good as a potential, but not good as ironclad. This is the standard you're going to meet, because it depends on the situation like we had there. If things didn't embody or reinforce respect for others, dignity for others, the rights of the people to care when it was dealing with people, I would be that disruptor. If I felt people were being harmed, I had to do that too many times to count. You take a look and say, here's the guidance from above, and here's what we're doing. No sense. Makes no sense. Why are we doing it this way? People just want to get it over with and get it done, instead of worrying about what's really the impact. What's the long-term impact? If we don't think about that, every choice that we made, as I've talked about in other talks here, we lose. We lose over time. I never mistake motion for action. You can cause people to move and do stuff, but action, true action, is achieving the goal that you set, not getting you exactly what you don't want, which is what I call an interception strategy. I could spot those easily. So here's my simple formula, and it kind of plays into that fail safe, fail catastrophic one. How to keep standards from becoming just something, a dusty binder on a shelf, or something completely ineffective in what you're doing. What's the S? Set the minimums. The S is set the minimums. Clear, fact-based as best as you can research it. Take the time necessary. I talk about the iceberg effect where you have what's on the surface, but there are ways that you can ask questions and get the tools and strategies in order to look past. What's the bottom line? In DoD minimum standards, we weren't guessing. We were preventing known threats, but we did have assumptions. We did have facts. And really important, we had what was our focus? What were we trying to achieve? And then having standards that were organized functionally and how you could explain it to others. There were 7 strategies. Progressive collapse was one, standoff was another, which I talked about, and we had more. But set the minimums, because if you're not at least doing that, then people could be harmed. A is aim higher for excellence beyond the minimum. I think I made that pretty clear. The minimum will keep you legal, maybe, but going higher may keep you alive, may keep the people you care most about alive and thriving and proud of your work. Years later, I can be very, very proud of the work that we accomplished. What's the F? It goes back to my story about the berm. Fail safe. Figure out how to put in standards that you know if something goes wrong or something you didn't anticipate, that it's going to fail safe, because if it breaks, it needs to break in a way that's not going to harm more people. It's going to keep them safe. With the Pentagon, we could have lost, like I said, thousands more people. And that robust construction for just the floors, even though the outer walls on the rest of the building were not designed to take that kind of impact. We were planning a truck bomb. That was the standard for the Pentagon, and that was an airplane. Like the Khobar Towers, it stood in spite of that massive amount of TNT directed right toward that building. What's the E? Evolve. Standards are not static. They have to evolve and adapt to new facts, new threats, incoming information. If you set a standard and then you walk away, you will find that conditions change. And maybe that standard is more hindrance than it is a help. Using judgment like Sully used, judgment, experience, and context. He didn't just follow a checklist. He had to use all of him in order to make that a safe landing for him and all the people on board. Enforcers will protect the minimums, but sometimes forget aiming higher, right? Facilitators often help with evolving, but they sometimes overlook the fail safe, right? They may not understand that piece of it. Disruptors like me, I cover all 4 of those. I see it as one picture moving. Look to the standards in your world, at work, in your family, in your community. Look at those, because the minimums are starting point. Or are they going to push you higher? What else can you do? Do they protect the people around you and yourself when things go wrong? That's what you want to do. If you're not keeping up reality, maybe it's time to stay safe and implement those 4. Some of you have asked, where do these topics come from? Well, I look at what's happening in the world today, and it truly is channeled to me from above to say this is a topic that needed to be talked about today. If it has been helpful, please share it with your friends and others who you think could use it, and helps you deal with the craziness that can happen each day. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. It's youtube.com/@stressintelligence. When we work together and understand these concepts and how they play out in the real world, we can help more people make better choices when the going gets tough and realize their full potential no matter what happens to them each day. Thanks for listening. Aloha.